not only for our study, but for the nation of Israel in general. We are introduced here in chapter 17. Basically, it's a story that reverberates through Jewish history. And when you see God as the rock of our salvation, for instance, it all stems, that name, the understanding of God as our rock stems from this episode here in Exodus chapter 17. Exodus chapter 17, as a matter of fact, is where we're introduced to Joshua for the first time, who's going to be Moses' successor. But this is the first time he is mentioned in the book of Exodus. But go ahead, let's go ahead and read it. And it's basically divided into two little sections that seem to be unrelated, but in fact they are very closely related. So let's go ahead and read chapter 17 and talk about it just a little bit. All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of Sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and encamped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said to them, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They are almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel. And he called the place of the name Massah and Meribah, because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" Then Amalek came and fought with Israel at Rephidim. So Moses said to Joshua, "Choose for us men and go out and fight with him, Amalek. Tomorrow I will stand on the top of the hill with the staff of God in my hand." So Joshua did as Moses told him and fought with Amalek, while Moses, Aaron, and Hur went up to the top of the hill. Whenever Moses held up his hand, Israel prevailed, but when he lowered his hand, Amalek prevailed. But Moses' hands grew weary, so they took a stone and put it under him, and he sat on it, while Aaron and Hur held up his hands, one on one side and the other on the other side. So his hands were steady until the going down of the sun, and Joshua overwhelmed Amalek and his people with the sword. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven." And Moses built an altar and called the name of it, "The Lord is my banner," saying, "A hand upon the throne of the Lord. The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." All right, so two basic incidents. They go, God leads them to a place called Rephidim. Rephidim means a place of rest. But now, why does God bring them to a place of rest with no water? They're in the desert. God knows they need water. But once again, the people's sight, they have lost sight of the fact that it's not Moses who leads them to Rephidim. It's God in the presence in the cloud and the pillar. God has led them here. And this is something that we oftentimes fail to understand because we view discipleship as sitting down and taking a study, don't we? If I say the word discipleship to you, that's what goes on in our mind. We're going to do a study. We're going to order discipleship books. We're going to take a discipleship course. But the fact is, the vast majority of discipleship takes place in the wilderness. Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Paul, all of them, Moses, their discipleship took place in the wilderness places. One of the reasons that God brought the people here to Rephidim was to test them, to disciple them, to teach them. It's the same reason he brings us to our wilderness places. We've all faced wilderness places. I have, you have. And it's in those places, it's in that wilderness where we learn to depend deeper on God, where our faith is grown, where our faith is strengthened. That's why God allows us to go through these wilderness places. That's why God allows us to face difficult times. Because true discipleship doesn't really happen. I mean, we learn things from the book, but true discipleship, to really put our faith into practice, We must go into the wilderness. That's what God is doing. He's still in the boot camp. But notice, God doesn't even say anything to the children of Israel. They have failed him again. They have failed to understand and to trust him once again. He put them to the test and they failed again. And they cry out, Moses, why did you bring us out here to die? You know, and we look back at this and we read it and we look at it in hindsight and say, what is wrong with these people? Don't they remember what God did in Egypt? Don't they remember how God separated the Red Sea? Don't they remember how God poured down bread from heaven and the quail for them to eat? Don't they remember any of this stuff? Don't they remember how God sweetened the waters? They don't. It's like they have amnesia. You know, it's like we talked about it, I don't know, last week, 2 weeks ago, that they start longing for the good old days. You know, they want to go back to Egypt where they, in their minds, they have created this false narrative of what Egypt was like. You know, we're starving out here, Moses. In Egypt, we had pots of meat, all we wanted to eat. Everything was there for the taking. No, you were slaves in Egypt, making bricks, and you had to gather your own straw. You have forgotten what it was like to be in bondage to the Egyptians. Oftentimes, Christians, when we face difficult times, when God brings us to the wilderness, we romanticize what our lives were like before we surrendered to Christ, don't we? Well, I had it made before I was a Christian. No, you didn't. You were enslaved to sin. God has set you free. Now he's discipling you, and part of that discipleship is that we must live these wilderness journeys. We all must face these wilderness journeys. I mean, that's why James says it, and Paul says it, and Peter says it, count it all joy when these wilderness things come into your lives. Count it all joy. Why should we count it all joy? Not because it's enjoyable, but because of what it produces within us. It produces a depth of faith and trust in God that we cannot find anywhere else. That's what he's doing here. He brings them to Rephidim, a place of rest. There's no water. And instead of looking to God to provide, like he has every step of the journey, and remember, there's the cloud and the pillar of fire by night right there. They can visually see God's presence in that pillar. And yet they accuse Moses of bringing them out here to die. They have forgotten it's all about God bringing them. God is directing this trip. God brought them to this wilderness. God brought them to this specific place. That's why Moses says, why are you grumbling at me? Why are you fussing at me? I didn't bring you here. God brought you here. And so Moses does what they should have done. Moses' response, because he has been discipled in the wilderness, he's still being discipled, he's still growing, and we see his growth throughout the book of Exodus. He never reaches perfection, but he grows throughout the book of Exodus. But they should have done exactly what Moses did, because Moses cried out to the one who could help. Moses cried out to where the only help could come from, God. Moses cries out to God. The people cry out to Moses, give us water. And Moses immediately turns to God. God, what am I going to do with these people? What am I going to do with these clowns? You know, they're just not getting it, God. They're just not getting it, right? You almost choked them to death on the quail. But now they're afraid they're not going to have water to drink. What am I going to do, God? And we're introduced to something here that has major implications for our faith. Because turn with me, if you would, to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. And maybe you'll see something that about the Exodus that you might not have seen before. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 1. For I want you to know, brothers, this is Paul, of course, writing to the church of Corinth. For I want you to know, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud, and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Now, these things took place as an example for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. Do not be idolaters, as some of them were, as it is written. The people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. We must not indulge in sexual immorality, as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in a single day. We must not put Christ to the test, as some of them did, and were destroyed by serpents, nor grumble, as some of them did, and were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened to them as an example, but they were written down for our instruction, on whom the end of the ages has come. Who is Paul telling us was in the wilderness with the children of Israel? Christ. It was Christ who was directing him. It was Christ who was with him. It was Christ who was the rock. Why do we call Jesus the rock of our salvation? It's from this incident. Because what does God tell Moses to do? Now remember the spiritual component of this. If the rock is a shadow or a type of Christ, what is going on here? The people are going to die without water. They have no hope without water. Moses, you go take the rod of God, which is what his staff. It wasn't a magic wand. I mean, we're not talking Harry Potter stuff here. It was a walking stick. It was a staff. There was nothing magical about the stick, about the wood. It was what the wood symbolized. Remember when God gave Moses the staff, it was Moses' staff to start with, right? At the burning bush, God said, what's that in your hand? Well, it's my shepherd's staff. We'll lay it down, it becomes a snake, right? You all remember that story? The staff stands for the power of God. It was the staff that Moses used. In other words, he appealed to the power of God to separate the Red Sea. He appealed to the power of God to turn the Nile into blood. All of these things that he did with his staff, not because it was magic wood, was because it was a symbol of the power of God. So he tells Moses to take the power of God and smite the rock. In other words, God himself is going to smite the rock of our salvation. He's going to, as Isaiah 53 tells us, he's going to pour out his wrath on his Redeemer. Right? That's what saves us, is the wrath of God was poured out on Jesus. This has been symbolized when Moses strikes the rock, and out of the rock flow living waters. Turn Revelation chapter 22. One of the most beautiful verses in the scripture, at the very end of the Bible, Revelation 22. The Spirit and the bride say, come, verse 17. And let the one who hears come, and let the one who is thirsty come. Let the one who desires to take the water of life without price. What is John saying here? He's saying that the living water that came out of the rock at Horeb is symbolic, and it's typology for the living water that Jesus offers us. Right? It's you have to get your mind around the symbolic nature of some of this language, because we're not talking about, water. I like water as much as the next person. We need water to live. It's what water symbolized to them. They were in the desert with no hope. They were going to die. We were in our sins with no hope. We were going to face the second death. We were going to spend eternity in hell unless God himself provided. And the way he provided was to smite his son. He poured out his wrath upon his son, and by doing so, he allowed his son to provide us the living water. He allowed his son, because his son willingly took on the wrath of God for us, now the son can provide what we need to live. He can provide life, the life-giving spirit that God offers. So the living water, you could look at it this way, it's symbolic of the Holy Spirit that God gives us when we accept Jesus' sacrifice, that we are given the guarantee, what we need to live, by the fact that God used his power to strike his son. This is why in Numbers, remember Moses, everybody remember why Moses is not allowed to go into the promised land?
Struck the rock.
In Numbers,
He struck the rock again, but with he did it of his own. He wasn't commanded to.
Well, he actually
did have it
I think it's Numbers 20. That could be wrong, but I think it's right around Numbers 20 somewhere. God said, we're similar situation. We don't have any water. God says, Moses, go speak to the rock. And instead Moses strikes the rock. Why was that such a horrible thing for Moses to do? Moses is angry. He strikes it out of his anger. But that's not why God was so upset with Moses. Because Moses had failed to understand the symbology of the rock. Jesus was only struck one time. Now the way that we get living water from the rock of our salvation is simply to ask. He only suffered once. Isn't that what the clear teaching in the New Testament is? That, and to be perfectly honest, this is one of the greatest issues that we have with the Roman Catholic Church, official Roman Catholic doctrine, is that every time the Mass is said, Jesus suffers and dies again. That's why you see on a Catholic crucifix, Jesus is still on the cross. You go in a Catholic church, they have a cross on the wall, Jesus is on the cross, because official Catholic doctrine is he is suffering repeatedly over and over and over and over. No, the scripture says he died once for all. Isn't that what the writer of Hebrews says? Once for all. And then he sat down at the right hand of the Father. And we talked about it before. The fact that Jesus is sitting means his work is done. He has accomplished everything that was needed to effect our salvation that one time on the cross, and his death, burial, and resurrection. And my mother's making me nervous because she seems to be checking up on me for something.
It's Numbers 20.
Huh?
It's Numbers 20.
Numbers 20?
Yeah, and Moses actually struck the rock twice.
Yeah. But yeah, God had said, speak to the rock. And Moses struck the rock. And that was very important to God, that Moses and us and the children of Israel understood what the symbology of the rock was, and Moses missed it. So that's the water from the rock at Horeb. Mara and Meribeth mean testing and grumbling. That's what those words mean. So we also see Psalm 95. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us make a joyful noise to the rock of our salvation. Let us come into his presence with thanksgiving. Let us make a joyful noise to him with songs of praise. For the Lord is a great God and a great King above all gods. In his hands are the depths of the earth. The heights of the mountains are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before God, before the Lord our Maker. For he is God, and we are the people of his pasture and the sheep of his hand. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts as at Meribah and on the day at Massah in the wilderness, when your fathers put me to the test and put me to the proof, though they had seen my work. For 40 years I loathed that generation and said, they are a people who go astray in their heart, and they have not known my ways. Therefore I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Grumbling is a sin. Grumbling is taken very seriously by God. It's taken very seriously by God here. Why? Because these people, that's what he says in Psalm 95 through the writer of the Psalm. These people put me to the test even though they had seen my works. Of all the things that God had done for them up to that point, from all the plagues in the nation of Egypt, to bringing them out, to them plundering the nation of Egypt peacefully, to coming through the Red Sea, destroying Pharaoh's army, providing them bread every morning, providing them quails in the evening. Everything he had done for them, and yet they still put him to the test. Well, brothers and sisters, that's a serious thing to do. After we have seen all that God has done for us, I mean, let's talk about Unity Baptist Church. Look at what God has done for Unity Baptist Church. He's provided for us over and over and over. So when we begin to grumble and doubt, we're in essence putting God to the test. God has already shown himself faithful in our lives. He's shown himself faithful in my life. He's shown himself faithful in the life of Unity Baptist Church. What reason would we ever have to grumble if God is the one who led us there? That's what he's upset about here. God led them to Rephidim. He led them to Rephidim so he could bring the water from the rock. But yet they didn't have the patience, they didn't have the trust and the faith in God that he was faithful. God takes that very, very seriously. Do not put him to test. Paul says it, writer of Psalm says it. It's said over and over and over again. Isn't that what Jesus tells Satan when Satan is tempting him? Satan says, I want you to jump off the roof. If you're really the Son of God, jump off the roof. The angel's not going to let you fall. And what does Jesus say? It is written, thou shalt not put the Lord thy God to test. You shall not test him. Why? Because God is faithful, and he requires that we understand he is faithful. He requires that we understand that we belong to him, and if we belong to him, we are totally his. And he's responsible for everything in my life, whatever the outcome. So now, Amalek. Who knows who Amalek is? Anybody? Any guesses?
Is that one of the sons of Lot's daughters?
Nope. Close.
Yes.
Esau's grandson. Esau's grandson through Eliphaz. Eliphaz, was that his son? Had him with a concubine or something? I'd have to go back and look. But yeah, he's Esau's grandson. Now, why is Amalek important? Well, here God tells them that he's going to wipe out the memory of the Amalekites, right? If you turn over to 1 Samuel 15, God tells King Saul, you kill all the Amalekites, do not spare anything. Not a donkey, not a sheep, not a person, nothing. But what does Saul do? He spares Agag. He spares Agag and some of the choice sheep. And he tries to justify it. Well, you know, the sheep, they're good for, I was going to sacrifice them to the Lord. That's not what God told you to do. This is why God removed Saul as king, because he did not obey God's command to destroy the Amalekites. So what happens with the nation of Israel and the Amalekites? They're a thorn in the flesh for centuries because of the disobedience of Saul, of King Saul. It was the Amalekites who captured David's family and his men's family in Ziklag. If Haman was an Amalekite, if you read the book of Esther, it says Haman the Agagite, right? That means he's a descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king that Saul spared, still trying to wipe out the nation of Israel. They were a thorn in the flesh throughout their history because of the disobedience of one man. Now, never think that our obedience to God is optional, that it doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things. Because of one man's disobedience, centuries, they caused trouble in Hezekiah's day. Read about the life of Hezekiah, and you see it's the Amalekites who are behind the trouble. The Amalekites plagued the nation of Israel for centuries after this. Here's where it begins. They come to attack the nation of Israel. Brand new nation. Remember, God did not lead them directly to the promised land because he didn't want them to face war right at the very beginning. Well, here we're talking a couple months. That ain't been a long time to train, right? They probably gathered some weapons from Pharaoh's soldiers and washed up on the shores of the Red Sea. But that's why Moses says, Joshua, go pick some guys out. Go pick some guys out. We're not ready for this. But here comes the Amalekites trying to take advantage. Satan is using the Amalekites to try to destroy the nation of Israel, right? So here they come. So Moses says, Joshua, go pick out some guys. Go fight for us. And what Moses does is how we all must fight our battles. Because here's the truth. When we come to know Christ, we're going to face battles. God doesn't save us to put us on the sideline. He saves us so that we can join the fight. We are all on active duty for God. We're all expected to be in the game, to be in the fight. But how does Moses win this fight? Because let's face it, it's not Joshua's victory. It's not even Moses' victory. It's God's victory. I mean, there's a couple of translation difficulties in here because the exact translation is, and I think mine, the ESV is fairly close, where it says, Moses built an altar and called the name of it, the Lord is my banner, saying, a hand upon the throne of the Lord. Actually, the Lord is my banner, that Hebrew phrase actually means a hand on the throne of God. So what is it telling us? What is Moses telling us? What is that banner trying to tell us? It's that we are only successful in the battle when we are reaching out to God, when we are appealing to God. That's what, there's lots of fanciful things out there about what the staff and Moses, the significance of Moses' hands up in the air. I mean, there's some wild stuff out there in the commentators, but it's really very simple. He's appealing to God. He's got the staff of God. God, this is your power. I'm asking you, God. I'm praying to you, God. I'm seeking you, God. It's your power that will defeat this enemy. And that's symbolized when he got tired and his hands fell. Well, then Malachi started winning. But when he was in a posture of appealing to God, then Joshua and the nation of Israel prevailed. So Hur and Aaron held up his hands. In essence, it was Moses' hands on the throne of God. That's what the banner literally said, and that's the ESV follows it up with that explanatory note. But that's in essence what this is telling us. When we win the battle, when we're in the battle, the only way we can win is prayer. What does Paul finish when he tells us to put on the full armor of God? Put on the whole armor of God, and then he lists the armor. What does he finish it with? The most important piece. No. Pray. After you put on the whole armor of God, pray. Because unless you're praying, you're not going to win. We cannot defeat the enemy unless we're praying. Because it's not our strength, it's God's strength. And the only way that we can appropriate that strength for use in the battle is to appeal to him. So, and just a little interesting thing here in verse 14, then the Lord said to Moses, write this as a memorial in a book and recite it in the ears of Joshua, that I will utterly blot out the memory of Amalek from under heaven. That indicates that Moses wrote other things other than the Bible, other than the Torah, doesn't it? Oh, that's not in the Bible, except right here, where God's telling him to write it down. So that's neither here nor there for the lesson. That's just something interesting to me, because I'm a geek.
Why do you think God commanded Moses to tell Joshua all the things that God told him, like to read it aloud to him?
Why do I think it? I think it was probably because God is preparing Joshua to be his successor, to continue on where Moses. And this is like I said, this is the first time we're introduced to Joshua in the book of Exodus, right? It's the first time we hear his name. And he is the one that God has chosen to fulfill what Moses was not going to be able to do, to continue to lead the people. But even his very name is the same name as Jesus. That was Jesus's name, Yeshua, right? Means Jehovah saves, or Jehovah brings salvation. So Joshua is a type of Christ in that he leads the people to the promised land, right? And defeats the enemies and all of that. So yeah, Joshua is a very strong type of Christ. So my best understanding is this is part of Joshua's discipleship. This is part of Joshua's training. This is part of Joshua's preparation to lead his nation. So his education is beginning now. And we see throughout the book of Exodus, and even a number of Joshua's always with Moses. Yeah, it's Joshua and Moses who goes to the tent, who goes to the tabernacle when God's presence is there. It's Joshua's up on the mountain with Moses. He's Moses' right-hand man from this moment on. So, any other questions, comments, concerns? What's wrong with that? Nothing?